All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be. Welcome to the second week of the Science of Science Summer School. We have a really packed agenda this week with 12 mentors and presentations at the end of the week. I'm going to make a couple of announcements while we wait for James. The first one is that I share the mentorship sessions for today's afternoon and for the rest of the week. Some of you had questions, and I try to answer them over Slack. I share the mentorship sessions on Slack in the announcement channel. So the way they will work, you will just connect to the same Zoom link like this one, and we'll have breakout rooms for the mentors. And hey, James, and
hey,
we'll have breakout rooms for the mentors. And there are times, so sometimes there's one person, sometimes there are multiple people, depending on the availability of the mentors. Unfortunately, James cannot join us today for the mentorship session. So the people that are today will need to move to another day or to another mentor. So we'll still figuring it out.
Yeah, and I may be able to slice my schedule with that commitment, that other commitment, so that I can make, some or even most of that. I just realized I'm giving a very short talk at the Academy of Management that I'd agreed to a while ago. My apologies.
Yeah, no problem. So just let me know before 1:15 so that they know, the students know where. I mean, 1:15 my time, sorry. Okay, so and I'll share information about the project and the presentation for Friday and the micro grants. Hopefully today I'll have the announcement or the wording for that. All right, so I'll just start. We are probably waiting for James's talk. So I'll introduce James. He's a good friend of mine. We met, 10 years ago in the. I was really honored to be part of the Knowledge Lab, or join the Knowledge Lab rather than just see these major figures in the field of knowledge and discovery and computational social science, and what I later discovered will be science of science, which is where I work today. He works in collective systems of thinking and knowing, a very broad set of ideas about distribution of attention and intuition, the origin of ideas and shared habits of reasoning, to processes of agreement, accumulation of certainty and texture. He's especially interested in innovation, how new ideas and practices emerge, and the role that social and technical institutions play in collective cognition and discovery. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. He's also the faculty director of the master's program in computational social science there, and he's an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. So without further ado, James, please go ahead.
Can I share my screen? Can I share my screen?
Oh, sorry.
Somehow it's not letting me. Okay, now it is.
Okay.
Great. Perfect.
And you have 45 minutes, by the way. I have no way of telling you when this is gonna end. So if you have like 30 minutes of talk or some minutes for.
Okay, what I'm gonna do is two things. First, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm gonna set a gentle self-delimiting timer for 30 minutes. And then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. I'm delighted that Stephen David and Daniel Acuna have invited me to participate in the Science of Science workshop, conference. It's not a conference. What is it? What is this? School?
Summer school / conference, I guess.
It's a summer school.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, I'm deeply committed to this field, and I'm excited to talk about a number of different pieces of work that come together, not by intention, but just, and not really by accident, but just, a number of different investigations have shown again and again, without seeking to confirm this idea that diversity ends up being really important for catalyzing sustainable discovery. And so I'll show that in a number of different ways in the context of this talk. As Daniel mentioned, I run a computational social science program, a new journal, the Journal of Social Computing, which is really focused on computational social science, but also complex systems and kind of extreme human-computer interaction. How do we find ways to really, compute with, better designed communities in some ways, and design better communities through computation. As he mentioned, I run this knowledge lab, which is really focused on big data, machine learning, and intelligent crowdsourcing applied to understanding and transforming scientific and scholarly processes and beyond to political communication, understanding, and other kinds of civil knowledge. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how science as systems think and how can those systems think better. And so we've spent some time trying to help catalyze conversations in the science and policy worlds about how it is that science can be rethought and reformulated, how we can improve our institutions and allow us to accelerate collective thinking, collective discovery, and sustainable advance. So I'm going to organize this into 3 short chapters. One on how diverse and disconnected communities generate more robust insights in science and society. 2, on how diverse and disconnected expeditions or explorations end up generating novel collective inference for science and society as a whole. And then finally, the converse, can we design diversity beyond human limits to accelerate and punctuate discovery? If this principle is real, then can we actually identify the limits of human diversity, account for them, and do better in terms of actual discovery? And I'll explore a range of hindcasting experiments that propose this, and I'm in the context right now of collaborating with a number of different other groups to do this with real experiments in a number of areas, ranging from polymers, peptide design, drug design, and a number of other spaces. So I would say underlying this whole idea is that science and society are complex systems, that humans are, they behave like pack animals. We're searching for social affirmation and we find it. And that this leads to a number of patterns which can be problematic for the advance of science. So dense social connections that distort collective certainty and potentially slow novel discovery and invention. And so I'm going to start with that first chapter. Centralized communities generate less replicable results. This is in the context of what many have called the replication crisis. I don't think it's a crisis. I think it's just an acknowledgement of a pattern that's gone on for a long time that was really highlighted in the context of genetics and has caught fire in the context of social psychology in particular, but has reached into a number of other fields, ranging from economics and sociology and the social sciences to really throughout medicine. This idea that many scientific facts, especially or including those from high-profile journals, those that promote and select on novelty, are not replicable or have not been broadly or conceptually replicable. Which is to say, if you try to take the principle which is identified in those experiments in other contexts, that those principles end up not appearing to be robust across those contexts. So we're interested in what kinds of organizations, what kinds of groups, what kinds of communities ended up generating more and less replicable results in this context, this acknowledgement of broad scientific irreproducibility. And so we took a high throughput strategy for conceptual replication and reproducibility, which I'll describe in just a moment. And I'm going to describe it in a few different contexts. One is an exploration of drug-gene interactions. Another is gene-gene interactions within biological systems. A third is in the context of medical results. and then a few others, for example. So in the drug-gene interaction context, we basically take about 75,000 claims that have been extracted from the literature, and then we take a feature of modern biomedical science, especially in the context of perturbagens and drug identification and screening, which are these huge high-throughput experiments. These are robotically driven wet lab experiments in this context, which are performed on average about 120, but ranging up to 250 times per drug-gene interaction, right? Varied across the amount of time that the tissue culture is bathing in the drug, the amount of the drug that's added, and the cell line that it's tested on. So we're basically aligning these tests from the community with like a single experimentally consistent high throughput design to identify what is it, like what are community structures that end up influencing the likelihood that findings will be more or less replicated across this tightly controlled experimental context. And one of the things that we find is that there is collective correction in science. When things show up multiply in the literature, they're multiply replicated, then that is associated with high replicability and standardization in the context of these high throughput experiments. So that's good. Science is not totally broken. And we find the converse as well, which is to say, where you find contradiction in the literature, you also find high variance in the findings across cell lines, duration, and amount. Right. So it's like the disconnection and the disagreement in the literature could likely be a result of these contingencies that we find in the context of these high throughput experiments. But when you look at the centralization of the scientific communities, which is to say, when you've got individual researchers who are in many of these papers, which are associated with a particular drug-gene interaction, and if you look at the independence, so for example, this represents the Jacquard index of the intersection of the union of sociality, the number of authors, methodology, right, the specific methods which we extracted from these papers, and the prior knowledge or expectations which we derive from the citations of those papers. You find that social dependencies induce agreement. So if you've got more people that are the same across these papers, it's much more likely that you're going to achieve the same finding. That social dependencies correlate with limited methodological variation. So if they're the same class of people, they're going to be using the same tricks to figure out what they have found. And that findings from decentralized communities, right? So from those that have low social dependencies, low methodological and low prior knowledge dependencies are much, much less likely to replicate. Findings from decentralized communities are much more likely to replicate. And why is this? Well, this is because basically you've got situations where you may have 50 papers, in some cases up to 100 papers on the same drug-gene interaction. And each of them are describing a seemingly independent experiment, but they're not independent experiments, right? They may be 1.5 independent experiments, right? Because it's the same people performing using the same methodology and the same prior expectations about what it is that they're going to find, which are enhanced and really solidified in the context of their particular experimental design. And we find the same when we look at clinical trials as a whole. So the Cochrane library and the Cochrane database of systematic reviews is a large-scale meta-analysis system, which is used to harden and formulate clinical guidelines about which medical procedures are most stable as seen across the full universe of relevant papers. And one of the things that they're especially concerned about, and people in meta-analysis have been concerned about in general, is this idea of high variance, which is to say you might have one small, poorly performed study that shows the efficacy of a certain drug, and that may drive up the mean effect so that it appears significant in meta-analyses across studies, but it's not in fact significant. That's truly an outlier. And it turns out that we find that there's a larger, more problematic effect that goes the other direction, which is to say from under dispersion as a result of social, methodological, and prior knowledge connection between those papers. So even though they attempt to separate and cluster studies as a function of the same people associated with really the same clinical design and study, if you actually take into account each of the persons across those studies, all the things that they cite across those studies, you find a much larger underdispersion relative to what you would have expected at random, even if those two experiments had been finding and exploring the same interaction or system. And this is not entirely surprising because of this finding. This finding shows that when you have fields that are growing, right, that there is an exponential decline in the number of papers that enter the canon of those fields, which is to say the most highly cited papers of those fields. So basically these fields crystallize over time as a result of shared understanding. And a finding that we published about the social structure of disagreement in a paper with your summer school director, one of your summer school directors, Daniel Acuna, on clustered epistemologies. Here we looked at the social structure of disagreement, and we find in the reviews associated with PLOS One, and PLOS One has this very special review policy where ostensibly nothing is supposed to be taken into account except for scientific validity. So you're not supposed to, consider significance or relevance or anything that can be construed as subjectively defined, but only whether or not the finding is accurate and the experiments were performed correctly. And still here you see linear or superlinear association between rejections and co-authorship distance in this broader space. So again, another confirmation that people who are close, who end up sharing methodological assumptions, are much more likely to not only agree with one another, but just feel that they share a correct understanding about what is the right way to do science. And this has consequences. So, for example, we see that flocking slows down future understanding. And this is an experiment or a statistical experiment in which we examined the way in which chemical experiments over time were performed and how they were explored in the space. And in this little kind of like network heat map on the lower left, you see in the upper right, this Medline US patents. This is the empirical estimate of how it is that scientific explorations explore the space of possible chemicals. And the background is a planar graph that represents all of the chemical interactions which are present. And what you see is a repetition over and over and over again of individuals seeking to be perceived as relevant to the rest of the scientific community by staying very close to these hubs, to these important drugs or chemicals that everyone else has found confirmation for in the past. Moreover, if you flip this effect around and use it to produce a kind of a Bayesian uncertainty update for the entire field, you do much better at predicting the robustness of future findings. So this is in the context of gene-gene interactions. We take into account authorship, prior knowledge dependencies, social institution dependencies, the likelihood that you know each other and each other's work as a result of being in the same university system or being geographically close to one another. And we find that you can do much, much better at random at predicting the likelihood that a finding will be robust if you take into account these dependencies. And more specifically, here you can see across different databases about gene-gene interactions, that just as the number of communities, which is to say different and disconnected social author groups, are participating in the examination of that particular gene-gene interaction grows, you see a linear and massive increase in the area under the curve in your ability to predict the robustness of that finding in the future. If you want to found new explorations and new discoveries, new inventions based on these robust facts, you'll take into account these social disconnections to upgrade or downgrade your certainty about the robustness of an effect. And it turns out, of course, this is not true just in science, but you can see it in other connections or contexts as well. This is a study that we did on disconnection through political polarization, and showed that basically conservatives and Republicans, conservatives and liberals who were annotating Wikipedia as a function of their political ideologies, and we identified those political ideologies as a function of contributions, but it turns out we were able to pick out it predicted about a third of, so significant signal of their personal ideologies and their voting histories. And we find that basically Wikipedia pages which are edited by more diverse, politically diverse groups, their political pages are seen as much more robust and of higher quality by independent outside observers who have no window into the process by which those pages are constructed. Similarly, social issues pages and even science pages are improved as a result of that diversity. But the diversity, in this case, you can see if it's designed or aligned with the topic of interest, then that topic of interest is the thing about which it most improves the quality or perceived quality. So connected communities produce weakened results. Diverse communities produce robust reasoning and more robust results. So the second chapter in this exploration, and I realize I only have 12 minutes left, so I'll whip through this, is that robust facts are established across clusters and novel discoveries occur across fields, right? So how does science as a collective think? Well, you might consider, does it think by deduction, by logically extending from established facts or axioms in a field? Does it extend by induction, by imaginatively generalizing from observations to their furthest extent, the kind of the Francis Bacon perspective, or does it expand by abduction? Charles Sanders Peirce's conception that almost every recent advance in science, technology, and business comes from this creative production of hypotheses based on surprising or theory-defying evidence. So this is like the collision of deduction and induction, right? So you come in with an expectation, you're wrong, right? Like reality just, hits you on the side, and then that leads to the discovery or genesis of new hypotheses, which, inductively, which generalize the field. So we looked at this in the context of biomedicine, physical sciences, and patents. We built a manifold over the space of publications in which we sought to assess the novelty of individual papers by first predicting those papers. So we're trying to predict the full space of papers in the next year of publications, and those that are least predicted by this most predictive model are, in some sense, by definition, those that are most surprising. And we're able to show that people were, in fact, most surprised by those discoveries. So we built this manifold that predicted, if you did a Poisson draw of this high-dimensional manifold, you were able to achieve papers that were the most likely to show up in the next period. And of course, you do this over time by building this theta space, right? So our theta here has about 36 parameters, and so it's 36 dimensions. And then we've got this, so this 36-dimensional manifold, we do this Poisson draw of a hypergraph. At each point, a hypergraph is a set of sets. Each set is a paper, right? And that paper then ends up being, so our representation of a paper is a set of keywords. So it's a pretty impoverished representation, but we're able to predict with an AUC of about 0.98 distinguish between the papers that show up and the papers that don't show up in the next period. And if you invert that, we're able to identify these surprising papers, like this green paper, right, which kind of pulls together. This is an actual three-dimensional representation of the biomedical tag space, these kind of mesh term spaces. And here you see a really surprising paper, this plant thioredoxin H, where they identify an animal function in the context of plants and are able to kind of transfer a whole host of insights that they didn't people hadn't conceived as possible before. And people in the faculty of 1,000, which is a faculty evaluation of these papers, identified this and other papers of the like as being highly novel or surprising to the field. It turns out that this surprise in terms of content and in terms of context, of drawing together different citations, ends up being highly predictive, both of citations or the likelihood of being really a kind of a highly outsized cited piece, and also in terms of awards across the biomedical, chemical, and physical sciences. And in particular, if you take context and content novelty formulated in this way, you end up ex ante. So before you know which journal the thing is published in, you can know about 60% of the likelihood that it's going to be in the top 10% of citations. Okay, so I could say more about that, but I won't, given our time. What's interesting is where these things come from. The most novel discoveries, do they come from unusual people? So people who have kind of surprising careers as formulated across the space of terms that they're exploring as individuals? Turns out not really. Is it from unusual teams? Not really from unusual teams either. The thing that correlates both in the biomedical and in the physical sciences is surprising expeditions, where people from one part of the scientific space end up traveling to another part of that space and solving a problem in this other place that's never seen anyone like them, and no one from their kind of home part of the scientific space has ever traveled and solved problems in this other space. So these radical insights comes in conversation between established problems in one part of the scientific space and really scientific aliens, people really outside that space. Between insiders who identify familiar puzzles and outsiders who solve those puzzles with alien patterns, which suggests a pattern of disconnection through disciplines. And I think given my time, I'm going to skip over a set of findings about how large teams versus small teams discover things. But I think the underlying idea is that smaller teams have less overlaps and more independence, and larger teams end up being much more likely to overlap, and they're much more likely to do momentum discoveries that basically build on yesterday's hits, whereas small teams are much more likely to identify novel discoveries that are disruptive relative to the past. So I'm not going to go through those details. I'll just leave that. But what I would like to do is flip this around and pose the question, can we design diversity to increase collective imagination in the context of science, which is in some ways a way of validating the causality of the associations that I'm proposing, which is to say, if we amp up the diversity, can we explicitly improve the speed, the rate, the range of things that we might discover as being relevant scientifically. And this also speaks to a broader set of questions, I would say, about artificial intelligence in general. You know, typically we develop artificial intelligence with a human target, you know, that we're just trying to kind of take out. And here we're asking a different question. How can we identify an artificial intelligence, which is really an optimally alien intelligence, right? Which is the most complementary and the least substitutive of human efforts, because, you know, that's the kind of AI that we will want, certainly for science. So we're going to try to create something that's not performing the imitation game, right? That's not performing machine learning in the context of like following human moves, but one that does the opposite, that complements that. That's not, you know, trying to maximize humanoid creativity and doing something more efficient and arguably more ethical in the context of, you know, a world of 7 billion humans. So I'm going to look at this in the context of on the basis of this experiment that was published in Nature in July of 2019, that showed how unsupervised word embeddings could capture latent knowledge from material science literature. And what they did was they showed that they embedded a large swath of material science and chemical literature. And by embedding, they used a shallow neural network that identified the proximity between really desirable properties, in this context, energy-related properties like thermoelectricity, ferroelectricity, and photovoltaic capacity, and the chemicals that might be in the future predicted to have that property, right? And so what they did was, they embedded the literature, they found those properties, those materials that had not been conceived of as having those properties. They used proximity as a prediction, and then they looked, and it turns out that that prediction had about a 40% or 0.4 precision. So reasonably high quality predictions just as a result of kind of proximity in that space. And then we kind of want to do that and the opposite better by taking into account the distribution of scientists and cognitively plausible discoveries. So we begin with this idea of what inferences are most likely cognitively in space. So A's here are authors, properties and entities, or entities are like materials. So if an author is studying a property and they are also aware of independent studies of an entity or material, then they're most likely to conceive of the possibility that that entity has that property, right? Whereas if you have different disconnected sets of authors who are studying the property and the material, then it's less likely that they're going to individually or independently conceive of this because they're not engaged in that transitive reasoning. And of course, if there is no connection between a property and a material, then regardless of the connection, it's not going to be conceived of. So, so we can think of this also as a hypergraph, right? Except a complex hypergraph, which involves both authors and properties and materials, right? And so if you model this in this way, if you run random walks across this complex hypergraph, then the density of random walks across any part of the space is going to be proportional to cognitively available inferences that the scientific system or community is able to make about that property as being present in the context of that discovery. Okay, so what inferences are, and so we run these random walks and are able to kind of identify, and in this context, we generalize it also to things like coronavirus, right? That's a property. Something can heal coronavirus in humans, and then the entities are the drugs or chemical formulations that might be effective at doing that. We also look at this for hundreds of diseases and thousands of chemical perturbagens, as well as the energy-related properties described earlier. And what we do now is we take those random walks and we embed those walks instead of just the space of words, right? So it's a convolution of basically words available to people and the people through whom they're available. So we're embedding this space of cognitively available inferences. And what we find is right out of the gate with exactly the same formulation, we achieve 100% improvement in our ability to predict precisely these materials that are going to have these various properties. So in this context, thermoelectricity, we go from about 40.4 precision to 0.8, in ferroelectricity to about 0.85, and photovoltaic capacity about 0.95. So we're not making a wrong prediction. We're making all of the right predictions, and we see a similar increase as we study 100 drugs which are applied to about 450 different diseases in the scientific space. I can't read all the diseases on the y-axis, but trust me, I'm happy to share the complete paper. We also, as I mentioned, port this to the drug and vaccine context in the context of COVID-19, and we see a massive increase. Okay, so my 30 minutes are up. I'm going to wrap up here. And when I say a massive increase, it's about a 300% increase over just using the kind of the embedding results by taking into account the distribution of attention in the scientific community. In fact, there's a paper by Laszlo Barabási and colleagues where they built, a very deep, I think maybe 15-layer neural network that took into account all kinds of protein-protein connections from a number of different sources to predict the likelihood that certain drugs would be associated with COVID as identified in the context of clinical trials that were to come. And we do, and that's the pink line, we do even better than that, completely blind to any of those interactions, right? We're able to do better just by taking into account the distribution of scientific findings. And the reason we do better is because this green heat map is the density of author interactions in this space. And we see that we're just predicting things that at the peak of that landscape, on the ridges of that landscape, which is to say, we're predicting things that are available to people in that space. Surprise, surprise. So we're able to predict, in fact, the particular scientists and particular teams of scientists with reasonable accuracy that are going to make those particular discoveries. Those that are aware of the properties and aware of those materials are the ones that are most likely to propose them in future research. Surprise, surprise. So the interesting thing is this, okay? We flip it around to do the opposite. What if we don't want to just, beat or scoop scientists, but we're actually trying to complement them? We find that, for example, Word2Vec or more than just kind of like embeddings, if we actually avoid humans in this space, that we do much better at discovering in the distant future, right, than we do at discovering at the immediate future. When we take ground truth, not ground truth, but first principle simulations of properties like thermal electricity, ferroelectricity, photovoltaic capacity, and take these deep protein-protein interactions, for example, between diseases for which they're relevant and drugs that will knock them out or hyperactivate them relative to the disease, we find no decrease as we turn the dial between basically alienness and kind of humanness, like being the closest to the humans and the closest to the aliens. We actually see that the optimal space is much more distant from the kind of the human crowd than what we actually find consistently discovered in the scientific space. So we actually do much better by moving away and generating predictions which are basically at the boundaries between scientific fields, which are creating diversity that doesn't exist currently in the context of science and scientific discovery. Anyway, to conclude, to generate robust insight and rapidly advanced technology, you need an ensemble of diverse intelligences. And I'm going to suggest, that we can even expand this by adding and designing diversity optimally. Further, that for AI to make a big difference, especially in the context of discovery, we need a new AI, a radically augmentative intelligence that understands and programs past the limits of human reasoning and that trains diverse ensembles and assembles diverse ensembles of human and alien intelligences. Finally, that one can design diversity to catalyze advance, that innovation and discovery is fundamentally high dimensional, requiring social, institutional, and methodological disconnections. This is in some ways like an agreement of the importance of fields, actually, and field boundaries, so that they can be exploited for sustainable advance. That novel combinations of people, techniques, and problems end up being required to design optimal diversity that catalyzes and sustainably catalyzes future advance. So with that, I'd just like to thank some of the folks that were involved in this research and open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. Always fascinating to hear your latest research. So if there are any questions, lots of applauses in these little icons that appear on Zoom. So if there are any questions, please go ahead and use the microphone or the camera. Okay, so Fan has a question.
Take it away.
Hey, really fascinating talk. I believe people in this community more or less have read your work, but it's great to have this overview from your perspective. So all these conclusions and claims that you made are kind of based on the evidence drew from your previous work. And I think from your perspective, you might see more clear that so if this connection or more decentralized science helps advance scientific findings and discoveries, should we imagine that in the future, COVID already changed the landscape of work, kind of remote work is the trend, and people connecting like this via Zoom or this kind of, more decentralized, but some sort of a connection form. So I'm wondering if you see that's the trend, and if this trend kind of aligns with your finding that we should imagine this is how the future of the science and scientific work should be organized, like people all, work more isolated, but connecting in this kind of loosely way. So I think along these lines, where you're looking to.
So that's a great question. And the reason I'm turning away is I've got this other screen and I'm pulling up a paper that we're finishing up right now with some findings I don't think anyone's seen. That's interesting because it turns out that online, when you engage online, you're much more likely to engage with people like you. And so it actually drives down the diversity of your connections. It's much more difficult to sustainably, you don't go out. You're much more likely, for example, inside your physical institution to have conversations with people, sustained conversations with people who are not like you because of other connections, right? Because they share a department or because their children are on the same soccer team that your children are on, or you have houses next door to each other. Like physical proximity is one of the few ways in which we are able to really achieve sustainable, diverse conversations. And I'm just going to show you here. Give me one sec. A couple of let's see. Hopefully, this has the figures. If you look at okay, this is a paper that's under review right now. Here's my, I'll just kind of pull up the paper in general. Okay. Yeah, let's hope the figures are in here. Yes, they are. Okay. So, this is a study in which we performed a survey of tens of thousands of individuals, hundreds of thousands that we asked, but tens of thousands responded about their particular papers. And so, we randomly selected people and, from 16 different fields, and we randomly selected a paper of those people, and we randomly selected 2 citations from those papers, and we asked them detailed questions about those 2 papers that they cited. Did they remember those papers? How did they find those papers? How influential were those papers to the argument of the paper in question? And then we assessed, how close were the authors in institutional space. We identified how close were, the contexts and the contents themselves. Like we provided an embedding and saw how distant they were. And one of the things that we find really strikingly is if you're in the same department, right? There's more intellectual influence in a particular paper than otherwise. If you're in the same city, it's about the same, but it's much higher if you're at the same institution, but not at the same department, right? So actually, and these are the kinds of interactions that don't happen virtually, that are driven down virtually. Think about the Zoom meetings and the conferences that you've been engaged in online since the pandemic. It's much more likely that they're more closely aligned with your epistemological commitments and research interests. So I actually think that that this development, this kind of like distance development, is potentially problematic, for sustainable diversity, because basically people go to the most comfortable settings in interactional contexts like Zoom contexts where we, have fewer social cues. And it's not that you never go to things that are unusual to you, but you don't sustainably go to those things, which is where it is that people find these surprising papers. And we find this in every field at every time period, basically, right? So it turns out that distance, intellectual distance, is correlated with influence, which is anti-correlated with the likelihood of being inside your field, which is dramatically correlated with being inside your institution or being together in place, basically as a source of intellectual diversity. And we can even show how is it that people find those papers. They find them through personal connections, through seminars which are run by other people that they might know in the space. And it's completely anti-correlated with the likelihood, for example, that they find them online through information services like Google Scholar. So those are the least influential, the papers that they know the least, but are the most likely to be understood and expected by their peers. Anyway, so I think this is something that is potentially problematic. Another question. It looks like we've got a few.
We have lots of questions. So Han has a question.
Oh, hi, Professor Evans. This is very interesting. And I have one question is that we have seen that diversity can be very helpful to science. I'm wondering, can it be a double-edged sword, and how much diversity do we need to optimize? Is that a problem that we can optimize for science? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Okay. What's the cost of diversity? Well, transaction costs in the communication sense, right? It takes more time for diverse teams to produce papers, and their productivity is systematically lower. And that's demonstrable across cases. It takes longer for people to produce fewer, more novel and surprising papers. But I guess it depends on what it is, what game we're playing. Sometimes, in wartime, for example, we were trying to maximize advance based on scientific insights and understanding. So we were trying to maximize what I would call our deductive scientific inference, right? How can we basically milk all of the extensive transitive insights as a result of the things that we stably know? So that's a short-term game. And because it has strong diminishing marginal returns, right? Every paper decreases the rate of novelty and the relative importance and the kind of like the physical or inventive importance of the next paper. And so at the same time, you want to, if you're playing a long game, then you don't care at all really about the individual productivity rate of discovery. You want for the system as a whole to be much more likely to generate larger scale discoveries. And so in that context, you would actually really want to maximize or increase diversity. I guess, again, not just diversity in the context of teams, right? So in terms of like really surprising discoveries, like teams, having a team requires everybody on the team to buy into the possibility that that's a meaningful project. But we found that the most surprising discoveries, the teams hadn't even been forged yet because there were people from one area of science who bought into the possibility that their tools could solve a problem in another area of science before they'd even been able to recruit the people from that other area of science. They recruited them by publishing in their venue, right? So I think that I mean, at some limit, right, you can get so far out to, that you can't even communicate, right? In the same way that I would say hybrid vigor as a biological phenomenon where you see, as a result of interbreeding, like systematic robustness effects. But if the species get so far apart that they can't even have sexual congress, then there's no genetic communication, and you can't achieve the kind of hybrid vigor effect that you see across, dog breeds and other, kinds of contexts. So I think I think it depends what game you're playing. If you're playing a short game where you're trying to milk the benefits of current science, you want to minimize diversity. And I think if you're playing the long game where you want to maximize the marginal benefits, then you want to push diversity to the limits of communicative possibility and beyond. So
we have another question
Sorry.
from Sebastian.
Yeah, hi, really interesting work as usual. I have a couple questions. First, was there any structure to the false positives that you found in this exercise of trying to predict sets of papers? And related to this also, when you're trying to sort of use the leverage of alienness for an AI, right? And you're sort of making the AI as alien as possible. Are there any shortcuts that the AI takes to become more alien faster? And the last question is, if we're optimizing on diversity, how do you think that might affect peer review, right? Because, you know, one of the principles of peer review sort of working fast and efficiently is that, you know, you get evaluated by people who are acquainted with your field, right? But the principle that you're telling us about is, well, this would be foreign to the people who would be evaluating your work, right?
absolutely.
Let me be rude for one moment. Can you just answer one question? There were 3 questions, and just pick one, James, because there are lots of other people.
Okay, yeah, the structure of false positives wasn't that interesting. I mean, it had to do with some very specific chemical properties. I think, okay, I'm going to speculate on this last one about peer review. I think peer review is deeply problematic as an institution. I think it's built around, I think Paul David's origin story for peer review is not unreasonable. You know, you certainly see it contemporaneous with, you know, esoteric sciences needing to be evaluated by sponsors so that those patrons wouldn't be seen as complete dupes. You know, they basically provided insurance, you know, by having peers evaluate, especially mathematical discoveries that were arcane to them. So I think that's the underlying motivation, is basically to kind of avoid looking stupid. And I actually think that that's what journals are optimizing on. And I think that's what funders are optimizing on, is avoiding looking stupid, avoiding the perception of failure and the existence of actual failure. And I think what that's going to do is create exactly what they've bargained for, is it's going to minimize failure. And the problem is that outsized success is correlated with failure, right? And so you're at the same time, you're minimizing outsized success, you're minimizing disruptive success. And so I think peer review is really designed to limit outsized success. I think we need to up our failure rate. And I think this needs to be a kind of a public conversation and education about advance. And it's not just advance in science, this is advance in invention, it's advance in entrepreneurship. I mean, this is, you know, I think this is a doable public project, but it is a public education project that will be required to push this. Anyway, moving on, sorry. Great question.
Yeah, there is a couple more questions. So Dominika?
Yes, hi, hello, thank you for interesting talk. I wanted to ask you about rigid scientific institutions and rigid scientific system. How do we start to change it to actually incorporate discoveries you presented during this talk? How can we actually change the system to make it more efficient?
I think one of the reasons I'm engaged in this last experiment, and that I'm interested in general in like producing things that are predictive and that are generative tools, is precisely for this reason. For people who are engaged in the sciences themselves, they're dubious, and I myself am dubious, that if taking these principles into account, I can't do better. If I can demonstrate that I can do better by taking these principles into account, then that will attract attention, right? If I'm myself, you know, producing, you know, Science and Nature or other kinds of papers and discoveries that are perceived demonstrably as relevant by taking these principles into account, then I believe that, you know, that will help sell the relevant potency of these principles. So I think the first thing is just to demonstrate it, and then actively to sell it. And so one of the things that I hope that we're right now kind of firming up. We just got funding for, I think, 5 or 10. I think it's hopefully 10 years of Science of Science conferences in DC, where each year we're going to be speaking to policymakers surrounding organs of government that fund basic research in the US, and really kind of promote the importance of experimenting together and incorporating these principles. And I think this is going to have to be done at a country by country basis for the kind of organs of government, industry and beyond that are supporting this kind of work. But I think, I think these kinds of demonstrations are absolutely critical. I think hindcasting is simply not enough. It's enough to persuade people who are already persuaded. It's not enough to persuade people who are not predisposed to agree.
Great. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think Dashun gave us a couple of more minutes. He was gracious enough to give us those minutes, but I think he's already ready to go with his talk. Dashun,